water shimmer beneath the hillside lamps, flowing slowly along the narrow road. He stood beneath the clear umbrella, quietly watching reflections tremble in the puddles. The evening sky still carried traces of orange, fading softly behind drifting clouds, and every rooftop facing the harbor held pieces of the remaining light. A distant traffic signal blinked beside the coast, red against the blue-gray rain. While somewhere far below the staircase path, the siren disappeared into the city. You brushed raindrops from the railing carefully, listening to thunder beyond the ocean, then smiled because the warm rain still smelled faintly of summer flowers. The stone steps glistened beneath the streetlights, golden streaks across the silk pavement, and every power line stretching downhill buzzed softly in the damp evening air. You asked why rainy cities feel beautiful only after sunset arrives. I watched neon reflections drift through puddles and thought maybe darkness makes colors gentler. Hydrangeas climb the fences beside the alley, heavy with rainwater and wind, while tiny apartment windows near the harbor glowed quietly against the storm. The clouds moved lower above the bay, covering distant boats in silver haze, as warm rain continued falling softly across the sleeping summer town. Their evenings hidden inside rainy cities, neon colors blooming on wet roads, umbrellas glowing beneath hillside lights, and thunder rolling beyond the harbor. Evenings where the entire world slows down as if listening carefully to the rain, holding on to fading sunlight before night fully arrives. You leaned against the guardrail silently, watching reflections ripple below, the umbrella trembling slightly each time the ocean wind returned. Far beneath us, headlights crossed the coastline, leaving silver trails across the streets, and every stairway leading through the town disappeared into blue rain light. You whisper that storms make cities honest, 'cause everything shines without pretending. I looked toward the glowing harbor clouds and suddenly understood completely. The rain softened near the end of twilight, droplets slipping from tangled wires as evening settled slowly over the rooftops, like watercolors spreading through paper. Maybe some nights are meant to stay unfinished, half rain, half sunset, half memory already disappearing. The puddles kept carrying broken reflections, the thunder drifted farther toward the sea, and warm summer rain continued falling across the glowing hillside streets. No promises, no answers, only neon light trembling softly inside the rainwater below. By the time the clouds swallowed the last sunlight, the city had turned completely blue, except for the golden roads still shining after the storm. stairways smelled like rain and salt water. Warm air rising from the soakstone steps. You stood beneath the evening sky quietly, watching clouds drift across the glowing bay. The town below us flickered with reflections. Streetlights scattered through the puddles, and every narrow alley near the hillside carried traces of rain toward the sea. A fairy horn echoed somewhere in the distance, low against the rolling thunder, while flower vines hanging from old fences shivered beneath the summer wind. You reached out toward the falling rain, slowly catching droplets against your fingertips, then laughed because the ocean breeze blew them sideways through the light. Silver blue at dusk. You asked why rainy evenings feel nostalgic even while they're still happening. I listened to water moving through the drains and couldn't think of a simple answer. A cat crossed the wet downhill road carefully, vanishing beside the seawall path, while distant windows near the harbor glowed gold against the darkening rain. The smell of concrete mixed with seawater drifted upward through the stairways as warmth settled quietly across the sleeping coastal town. There are evenings hidden above rainy harbors, streetlights trembling on flooded roads, summer clouds hanging low above the ocean, a stairway shining after storms. Evenings where silence becomes heavier than the sound of rain itself, as if the city is holding its breath, waiting for night to fully bloom. You rested your hand against the damp railing, watching ripples spread through the bay, the umbrella beside your shoulder catching reflections from distant lights. Far below us, traffic moves slowly through puddles, headlights bending across the rainwater, and every alley leading toward the harbor seemed endless beneath the clouds. You whispered that beautiful nights feel temporary, even while standing inside them. I look toward the glowing coastline, wish the rain would never stop. The thunder faded farther beyond the ocean, leaving only soft rainfall behind, as the city lights deepened gradually into shades of violet and gold. Maybe rain changes cities into memories before people even realize they're already beginning to miss them. The harbor stairway kept shining in the rain. The clouds drifted slowly above the coastline, and warm summer wind carried the scent of seawater through the quiet town. No music, no footsteps, only rainfall moving endlessly toward the glowing harbor below. By the time the storm disappeared into the sea, the streets had become rivers of light, and the night air smelled entirely of rain and salt water. Violet reflections spread across the hillside road. After the rain softened into mist, you stood beside the narrow stone fence, watching the city lights flicker below. The clouds still carry traces of sunset, fading slowly behind the harbor skyline. And every puddle gathered near the stairways held pieces of the evening sky. A warm breeze drifted through the wet hydrangeas, shaking droplets onto the pavement. While somewhere far beneath the rooftops, a distant bell echoed through the rain. You traced circles through the fog, railing quietly, listening to water slide through the drains. Then smiled because the storm made the whole town glow blue. The downhill streets shimmered beneath neon signs, stretching endlessly toward the coast. And every telephone wire crossing the sky caught silver light from the clouds. You asked whether rainy nights feel lonely or simply quieter than usual. I watched reflections tremble beside our shadows and thought maybe silence changes shape in storms. Flower petals clung to the soaked stone walls, darkened by the summer rain, while tiny windows scattered across the hillside burned softly against the mist. The harbor disappeared beneath drifting fog, blurring boats into watercolor shapes as warm rain continued falling gently across the sleeping evening city. There are nights hidden inside rainy hillsides, violet reflections on flooded roads, umbrellas glowing beside stone stairways, and thunder fading above the sea. Nights where a city stopped feeling crowded because rain wraps everything in distance, leaving only light and shadow floating quietly through the storm. You rested beneath the dripping trees silently, watching clouds move beyond the bay. The transparent umbrella beside your shoulder filled with tiny trembling lights. Far below us, headlights crossed wet intersections like rivers flowing through darkness. And every alley climbing toward the hillside shines silver beneath the rain. You whispered that storms feel endless when viewed from high above the city. I looked toward the glowing harbor mist and forgot how late it had become. The rain weakened into scattered droplets, sliding slowly from tangled wires as the final traces of sunset vanished behind the clouds over the sea. Maybe beautiful nights never fully disappeared. They remain somewhere inside the rain, waiting for certain lights to bring them back again. The hillside road kept reflecting the storm. The harbor lights drifted through the mist, and warm summer rain continued falling across the glowing city below. No voices, no movement, only violet light spreading softly through the puddles after sunset. By the time the clouds covered the horizon, the stairways had fallen completely silent. turning wet streets into flowing mirrors. You stood beneath the sun or clouds quietly, watching the coastline fade into evening. The sky still glowed behind the rainfall, orange dissolving into deep blue, and every rooftop facing the ocean shimmered beneath the drifting storm. A row of lanterns near the seawall flickered, reflections stretching through puddles, while somewhere beyond the darkened harbor, thunder rolled softly above the waves. You brushed rainwater from your sleeves, slowly breathing in the scent of wet flowers, then laughed because the warm wind kept carrying rain beneath the umbrella. The stairways leading down the hillside gleamed beneath the streetlights, and every narrow path between the houses looked endless in the rain. You asked why storms make cities beautiful, only for a little while. I watched golden reflections break apart in puddles, and thought maybe beauty always works that way. Hydrangeas bent beneath the rainfall, droplets slipping from their petals, while distant apartment windows near the harbor glowed gently through the mist. The ocean wind climbed through the alleyways, cool against the humid night, as clouds drifted lower above the bay, hiding the horizon completely. There were evenings hidden inside rainy harbors, golden lights across flooded streets, summer storms hanging above the coastline, and umbrellas glowing beside stone paths. Evenings where time seems slower, as if the rain itself is remembering something, holding the city still before the darkness deepens. You leaned against the damp railing quietly, watching reflections move below, the sound of rainfall mixing softly with distant waves against the shore. Far beneath us, traffic lights changed colors, red and green through the storm, and every puddle gathered near the hillside captured fragments of the sky. You whispered that rainy nights feel unreal, like scenes from forgotten films. I looked toward the glowing harbor clouds and let the silence answer instead. The rain softened near the edge of midnight, becoming mist above the rooftops, as the city lights deepened gradually into shades of amber and violet. Maybe storms turn ordinary places cinematic for only a few quiet hours before morning washes the magic away. The harbor continued shining through the rainfall. The clouds drifted endlessly above the sea, and warm summer wind carried reflections across the flooded hillside roads. Now invisible, except for scattered lights floating beneath the rain clouds. Lantern colors drifted across the rain-soaked road, blurring softly beneath the evening lights. You stood at the top of the hillside, quietly watching umbrellas bloom along the streets. The clouds still carried fading shades of coral above the darkening harbor water, and every puddle gathered near the stone steps reflected pieces of the glowing sky. A row of vending machines near the alley buzzed faintly through the warm rain, while somewhere farther down the coastline, thunder dissolved into the sea breeze. You brushed damp hair behind your shoulders slowly, listening to water fall from rooftops, then smiled because the lantern reflections kept breaking apart beneath your shoes. The narrow downhill paths shined silver blue under the trembling street lights, and every flower vine climbing the fences held droplets brighter than glass. You asked whether rain changes colors at night, or if cities simply become softer. I watched orange reflections ripple through puddles and thought maybe storms blur everything gently. A balcony wind chime rang once in the distance, almost hidden beneath the rainfall, while tiny harbor lights below the hill flickered through drifting mist. The ocean disappeared behind low clouds, leaving only moving shadows as warm summer rain continued quietly across the sleeping evening town. There are nights hidden inside rainy cities, lantern colors trembling on flooded roads, umbrellas glowing beneath coastal clouds, and stairways shining after storms. Nights where silence spreads slowly from the ocean to the rooftops, until the whole town feels suspended inside rain and fading light. You leaned against the damp guardrail, silently watching reflections slide downhill. The transparent umbrella beside you filled with tiny fragments of neon. Far below us, the harbor breathed softly, covered in silver rain haze, and every narrow road crossing the hillside looked endless beneath the storm. You whispered that beautiful evenings feel fragile because they disappear while unfolding. I looked toward street lights scattered across the bay, and every rooftop climbing the hillside shined beneath the stormy sky. A warm wind carried the scent of seawater through the soaked evening air, while somewhere beyond the breakwater, rain drifted across the dark ocean. You tightened your grip around the umbrella handle, listening to thunder move farther inland, then laughed because the lightning turned the puddles white for a second. The narrow roads curved through the hillside slowly, flooded with blurred reflections, and every telephone pole stretching above the town vanished into drifting rain haze. You asked why storms make nights unforgettable, even when nothing really happens. I watched water flow along the stone pavement and thought maybe stillness leaves deeper memories. Hydrangeas trembled beside old fences, heavy with summer rain, while tiny windows near the harbor burned gold beneath the dark clouds. The sea disappeared into layers of mist, only waves remaining visible as warm rain continued falling softly across the sleeping coastal streets. There are evenings hidden inside thunderstorms, lightning booming above quiet harbors, umbrellas glowing along wet stairways, and clouds hanging low over the sea. Evenings where the world feels paused between rainfall and fading sunset, as if the city itself is waiting for the storm to finally breathe out. You rested beneath the dripping trees silently, watching distant lights ripple below, the umbrella beside your shoulder shaking softly in the ocean wind. Far beneath those reflections crossed the flooded road stretching toward the coastline, and every narrow alley disappearing downhill looked endless beneath the rain. You whispered that thunder sounds beautiful when heard from far above the city. I looked toward the glowing storm clouds and suddenly hoped the night would last longer. The lightning faded deeper into the distance, leaving only soft rainfall behind, as the harbor lights blurred gradually into shades of silver and amber. Maybe storms turn cities into dreams for a few quiet hours, before morning pulls everything back into reality. The thunder continued rolling beyond the coastline, the rain kept shining beneath the streetlights, and warm summer winds carried mist across the sleeping harbor town. No answers, no movement, only lightning flickering softly above the darkened sea. By the time the storm moved beyond the bay, the roads had become rivers of light, and the night air smelled entirely of rain and seawater. Amber clouds drifted slowly above the coastline, still glowing after the evening storm. You stood beside the rain-dark stairway quietly, watching water shimmer beneath the streetlights. The city below us flickered through the mist, golden reflections spreading across the roads, and every rooftop near the harbor held traces of fading sunset colors. A warm breeze moved through the soaked flowers, stretching above the town, vanished into the low evening fog. You asked why rainy skies feel endless near cities beside the ocean. I watched reflections tremble beneath our feet and thought maybe water makes everything deeper. Hydrangeas leaned against old concrete walls, heavy from the summer rainfall, while distant windows across the hillside glowed softly behind lace curtains. The harbor lights drifted through the mist below, blurring into lines of gold as warm rainwater continued sliding quietly toward the sea beyond the town. There are evenings hidden after summer storms, amber clouds above flooded streets, street lights trembling across wet stairways, and ocean wind moving through the rain. Evenings where silence becomes luminous, like the city is glowing from inside itself, holding on to the final colors of sunset before the night fully arrives. You rested beneath the dripping vines quietly, watching clouds dissolve above the bay. The umbrella hanging loosely beside you, catching tiny reflections from the road. Far below us, the harbor shimmered softly, covered in blurred golden lights, and every narrow alley leading downhill seemed endless beneath the evening mist. You whispered that storms make cities feel alive in ways sunlight never can. I looked toward the glowing rooftops below and forgot the sound of the ocean completely. The rain faded into scattered droplets sliding from tangled electric wires as the sky deepened slowly from orange into dark shades of violet blue. Maybe beautiful nights happen quietly without anyone realizing, until years later when rain brings them back again. The amber clouds continue drifting slowly above the sleeping seaside city, and warm summer wind carried reflections across the flooded hillside roads. No hurry, no voices, only fading sunset colors floating softly through the rain. By the time the clouds covered the horizon, the city had turned almost entirely blue, except for scattered lights still glowing after the storm. Rain mist floated above the harbor lights, softening the edges of the evening city. Stood beneath the narrow hillside trees, watching droplets gather along the leaves. The storm clouds still moved beyond the coastline, dark against the fading orange sky, and every soaked rooftop near the bay reflected pieces of the remaining light. A distant lighthouse blinked across the water, hidden between layers of mist. While somewhere farther down the stone stairways, rainwater rushed toward the sea, held the clear umbrella loosely beside you, listening to thunder fade beyond the hills, then laughed because the ocean wind kept carrying rain against your every puddle gathered near the harbor caught trembling fragments of neon. You asked why rainy evenings feel cinematic even in ordinary places. I watched fog drift through the streetlights and thought maybe storms erase distractions. Flower shadows moved along the wet fences, bending softly in the sea breeze, while tiny windows glowing through the rain looked warmer than usual tonight. The mist thickened above the harbor water, hiding distant boats completely as warm summer rain continued falling across the sleeping coastal town. There are nights hidden inside rain mist, harbor lights dissolving through the fog, umbrellas glowing beside flooded stairways, and clouds hanging low above the sea. Nights where the city feels suspended, halfway between dream and rainfall, as if the storm itself is painting light across the darkened streets. You leaned against the damp stone railing quietly, watching reflections drift below, the umbrella trembling beside your shoulder each time the ocean wind returned. Far beneath us, headlights crossed wet roads like rivers of silver through the rain, and every alley winding through the hillside disappeared into the evening haze. You whispered that some nights feel unreachable even while standing inside them. I looked toward the hidden harbor lights and suddenly understood exactly what you meant. The thunder disappeared behind the coastline, leaving only soft rainfall behind as the clouds deepened gradually into endless shades of midnight blue. Maybe storms make cities unforgettable by hiding half their beauty inside mist and shadow, where imagination finishes the rest. The harbor lights continued glowing softly beneath the drifting summer rain, and warm ocean wind carried reflections across the flooded hillside town. No endings, no explanations, only silver rain mist moving slowly through the sweeping city below. By the time the final street lights blurred, the sea had vanished into darkness, except for one faint lighthouse still blinking beyond the rain. Sunset rain gathered along the stone steps, turning every puddle orange and blue. You stood beneath the summer clouds quietly, watching the hillside glow after the storm. The harbor below us shimmered with reflections, streetlights trembling across the water, and every narrow alley beside the rooftops held rivers of fading sunlight. A warm wind drifted through the silk flowers, carrying the scent of wet concrete, while somewhere far beyond the coastline, thunder faded into the evening haze. flooded with blurred reflections, and every utility wire crossing the sky caught silver light from the clouds. You asked whether sunsets feel different after summer rain has passed. I watched puddles ripple beneath the stairways and thought maybe storms make colors linger longer. Hydrangeas leaned over old stone walls, heavy with rainwater and shadow, while distant apartment lights near the bay glowed quietly against the darkening sky. The sea breeze climbed through the hillside paths, cool against the humid evening air, as warm mist drifted slowly across the sleeping coastal town. Their evenings hidden after rainfall, sunset colors trapped inside puddles, umbrellas glowing on narrow stairways, and harbor lights beneath drifting clouds. Evenings where the world becomes softer, like rain has washed the noise away, leaving only light and silence hanging gently over the city. You rested beside the dripping flower vines quietly, watching reflections move downhill, the transparent umbrella beside your shoulder filled with fragments of neon light. Far below us the harbor breathed softly, covered in silver evening mist, and every rooftop facing the coastline shimmered beneath the fading storm. You whispered that beautiful cities feel fragile when viewed the rain and sunset together. I looked toward the glowing clouds above the bay, and suddenly wished the evening would stop moving. The rainfall weakened into scattered droplets, sliding from tangled electric wires, as the sky slowly deepened from coral into shades of deep violet. Maybe storms preserve certain evenings before time can erase them, holding them still inside rainwater for someone to remember later. The puddles continued carrying sunset colors across the flooded hillside roads, and warm summer wind drifted quietly through the glowing harbor town. No footsteps, no voices, only reflections trembling softly after the rain had passed. By the time the clouds covered the last sunlight, the stairways had fallen completely silent, except for rainwater flowing slowly toward the sea below. Shadows drifted across the rainy coastline, darkening the harbor little by little. You stood beneath the wet hillside trees, watching evening settle over the town. The roads below us shimmered beneath streetlights, gold stretching through the rainwater, and every rooftop near the seawall held traces of the fading storm. A lighthouse blinked beyond the distant bay, barely silver blue against the darkening sky. And every puddle gathered near the hillside reflected broken pieces of sunset. You asked why coastal cities feel lonely during warm summer storms. I watched mist drift across the harbor lights and thought maybe oceans make silence larger. Hydrangeas trembled beside soaked fences, droplets shining beneath neon signs, while tiny windows scattered through the town burned amber against the rain. The clouds lowered slowly over the bay, hiding boats beneath the darkness as warm evening rain continued falling across the sleeping seaside streets. There are nights hidden along rainy coastlines, cloud shadows crossing flooded roads, streetlights glowing beneath summer storms, and ocean wind moving through the mist. Nights where the city feels weightless, like reflections floating across water, as if the rain itself is carrying the entire town toward the sea. You leaned against the damp guardrail quietly, watching headlights blur below the umbrella trembling beside your shoulder. Each time thunder rolled across the harbor, far beneath us narrow alleys twisted downhill, filled with silver rain light, and every rooftop facing the coastline vanished slowly into evening fog. You whispered that storms feel endless when viewed from high above the city. I looked toward the hidden horizon and forgot how late the night had become. The thunder faded farther beyond the ocean, leaving only soft rainfall behind, as the clouds deepened gradually into endless shades of midnight blue. Maybe some nights are too beautiful to belong completely to reality, so rain turns them briefly into something dreamlike. The cloud shadows continue drifting slowly above the glowing harbor town, and warm summer winds carried reflections across the flooded coastal roads. No music, no movement, only rain and distant light breathing quietly through the darkness. By the time the mist swallowed the horizon, the sea had become almost invisible, except for scattered harbor lights still trembling beneath the storm. Blue rain lights spread across the rooftops, like watercolors sinking into paper. You stood beside the hillside railing quietly, watching the storm settle over the harbor. The clouds still carried fading sunset colors, hidden beneath layers of evening gray. And every puddle gathered along the storm. The downhill roads shimmered beneath street lamps, stretching toward the rain-covered bay. And every telephone wire crossing the skyline vanished into drifting mist. You asked why rainy evenings feel cinematic, even without anything happening. I watched reflections move through the flooded streets and thought maybe storms slow the world down. Flower shadows tremble beside old fences, darkened by the summer rain, while distant harbor lights below the hill glowed softly against the clouds. The sea breeze climbed through the narrow alleys, cool against the humid night air, as warm rain continued falling gently across the sleeping seaside town. There are nights hidden inside summer storms, blue reflections across flooded rooftops, street lights glowing beside wet stairways, and thunder fading over the ocean. Nights where the city feels suspended, halfway between memory and dream, as if the rain itself is protecting the final colors of sunset. You rested beside the dripping stone wall quietly, watching clouds move beyond the harbor. The transparent umbrella beside your shoulder filled with scattered reflections. Far below us the coastline shimmered softly, covered in silver rain haze, and every narrow road climbing uphill looked endless beneath the storm. You whispered that rain makes cities beautiful because nothing stays completely clear. I looked toward the glowing clouds above the bay and suddenly understood exactly what you meant. The thunder drifted farther toward the horizon, leaving only soft rainfall behind, as the evening deepened slowly into shades of violet and blue. Maybe beautiful nights survive through reflection, puddles, windows, and lights blurred by rainwater. The rooftops continued shining beneath the rainfall. The harbor lights drifted through the mist, and warm summer wind carried silence across the flooded hillside town. No answers, no footsteps, only blue rainlight trembling softly through the evening streets. By the time the clouds covered the coastline, the city had become entirely silver blue, except for distant lights still glowing after the storm. Warm rain drifted through the harbor wind, soft against the summer evening air. You stood at the edge of the hillside path, watching the coastline disappear into mist. The city below us shimmered beneath street lights, gold reflections across flooded roads, and every rooftop facing the ocean held traces visible above the bay, while somewhere beyond the stone stairways, thunder dissolved into the dark clouds. You held the clear umbrella loosely beside you, listening to raindrops touch the pavement, then laughed because the wind kept carrying seawater through the storm. The narrow roads winding through the hillside shine silver beneath the neon signs, and every puddle gathered near the harbor reflected broken pieces of evening light. You asked whether storms make cities lonelier or simply more honest. I watched warm rain slide down the railings and thought maybe both things happen together. Hydrangeas bent beneath the heavy droplets, dark against the glowing streets, while tiny windows scattered across the town burned softly through the mist. The ocean disappeared beneath drifting fog, leaving only the sound of waves as warm summer rain continued falling across the sleeping harbor city. There are evenings hidden inside coastal storms, warm rain crossing flooded roads, street lights glowing beside narrow stairways, and ocean wind carrying thunder. Evenings where silence spreads gently from the harbor to the rooftops until the entire city feels wrapped inside rain and fading light. You leaned against the damp railing quietly, watching reflections ripple downhill, the umbrella trembling beside your shoulder each time the sea breeze returned. Far below us, headlights crossed the coastline, stretching through the flooded streets, and every alley disappearing toward the harbor looked endless beneath the rain. You whispered that storms feel temporary even while standing inside them. I looked toward the glowing clouds above the sea and suddenly wished the rain would never end. The thunder faded beyond the horizon slowly, leaving only scattered droplets behind as the city lights deepened gradually into amber and midnight blue. Maybe rain changes ordinary evenings into scenes people remember forever without understanding why at the time. The harbor wind continued carrying warm rain across the glowing hillside roads, and reflections drifted quietly through the sleeping coastal town. No music, no voices, only rainfall moving endlessly toward the darkened sea. By the time the storm disappeared beyond the bay, the streets had become rivers of light, and the night air smelled entirely of rain and ocean winds. Silver rain slid through the alley lights, turning the hillside road into glass. You stood beneath the dripping power lines, watching reflections gather near the steps. The evening sky still carried faded crimson, hidden beneath layers of storm clouds, and every rooftop facing the harbor shimmered beneath the warm rainfall. A soft ocean breeze moved through the hydrangeas, scattering droplets across the pavement, while somewhere beyond the dark coastline, thunder drifted farther into the sea. rested your hand against the wet railing quietly, following streams of water downhill, then smiled because the rain light made the entire city glow softly. The narrow paths winding beside the houses filled slowly with silver puddles, and every utility pole above the stairways vanished into drifting mist. You asked why rainy evenings feel endless near cities built beside the ocean. I watched reflections tremble through the flooded roads and thought maybe storms stretched time gently. Flower petals clung against silkstone walls, darkened beneath the evening rain, while distant harbor windows below the hill burned quietly against the clouds. The sea disappeared behind curtains of mist, leaving only the sound of rainfall as warm summer wind continued moving across the sleeping hillside town. There are nights hidden inside summer rain, silver reflections across narrow alleys, streetlights glowing above flooded stairways, and thunder fading over the harbor. Nights where silence becomes luminous, like the storm is carrying light itself through every rooftop and puddle before the darkness fully arrives. You lean beneath the dripping vines silently, watching clouds move across the bay. The umbrella beside your shoulder filled the fractured neon colors. Far below us the harbor shimmered faintly, covered in silver evening haze, and every alley disappearing downhill looked endless beneath the rainfall. You whispered that storms make cities feel distant even while standing inside them. I looked toward the glowing clouds above the ocean and forgot how long we had been there. Thunder faded beyond the coastline slowly, leaving scattered droplets behind as the evening deepened carefully into shades of indigo and gold. Maybe rain transforms ordinary cities into places memory refuses to leave behind. The alley lights continued trembling softly across the flooded hillside roads, and warm summer rain kept falling quietly over the glowing harbor town. No footsteps, no conversations, only silver rain sliding endlessly toward the sea below. By the time the clouds covered the horizon, the city had become entirely blue-gray, except for scattered reflections still moving through the rain. Distant lightning flickered above the harbor, clouds bright against the deepening evening sky. You stood beside the rain-covered stairway, watching the storm drift across the coastline. The streets below us glow beneath the rainfall, golden reflections crossing the city, and every rooftop climbing the hillside held traces of the fading sunset. A warm wind carried the scent of seawater through the dim summer air, while somewhere far beyond the breakwater thunder rolled across the bay. You Hydrangeas bent beneath the heavy rainfall, droplets trembling on their petals, while distant windows glowing through the town burned amber against the storm. The ocean vanished beneath layers of rain haze, leaving only blurred lights behind, as warm summer rain continued falling across the sleeping coastal streets. There are evenings hidden inside thunderstorms, lightning blooming above flooded rooftops, streetlights glowing beside narrow stairways, and clouds hanging low over the sea. Evenings where the city feels suspended between rainfall and fading light, as if the storm itself is holding the entire coastline still. You rested against the damp guardrail quietly, watching reflections slide downhill. The transparent umbrella beside your shoulder, filled with silver fragments of neon. Far below us the harbor shimmered faintly, covered in drifting rain mist, and every narrow road leading toward the bay looked endless beneath the clouds. You whispered that lightning feels lonely because it disappears too quickly. I looked toward the glowing storm above the ocean and suddenly understood what you meant. The thunder drifted farther beyond the coastline, leaving only soft rainfall behind, as the city lights deepened gradually into shades of violet and midnight blue. Maybe storms become unforgettable because they illuminate everything briefly before returning the world to darkness. The harbor clouds continued carrying lightning above the glowing seaside town, and warm summer wind drifted quietly across the flooded hillside roads. No movement, no music, only distant thunder echoing softly beyond the rain dark sea. By the time the storm faded into the horizon, the coastline had nearly disappeared, except for scattered harbor lights still trembling beneath the clouds. Rain glow drifted between the hillside houses, soft amber spreading across the whetstone road. You stood beneath the tangled flower vines, watching the harbor disappear into mist. The evening clouds still carry traces of coral fading quietly above the coastline, and every puddle gathered near the stairways held broken pieces of the sunset. A warm breeze moved through the soaked hydrangeas, shaking droplets from the petals, while somewhere beyond the seawall thunder rolled low above the dark water. You touched the damp railing beside the alley, listening to rain slide through the gutters, then smiled because the reflections made the whole city look endless. The narrow roads curling down the hillside shine silver beneath the streetlights, and every rooftop facing the ocean blurred softly through the evening rain. You asked why storms make ordinary places feel impossible to forget. I watched neon colors ripple through puddles and thought maybe rain softens every memory. Flower shadows trembled against concrete walls, darkened by the warm rainfall, while distant harbor lights below the hill burned faintly through the mist. The ocean wind climbed slowly through the alleyways, cool against the humid night. A summer rain continued night falling gently across the sleeping coastal town. There are nights hidden inside rainy hillsides, streetlights glowing across flooded paths, cloud shadows drifting above the harbor, and umbrellas shining beside stone steps. Nights where silence stretches farther than the sound of thunder itself, as if the city is breathing slowly beneath the falling rain. You lean beneath the dripping trees, quietly watching reflections slide downhill. The clear umbrella beside your shoulder, filled with scattered colors from the streets. Far below us, headlights crossed wet intersections like rivers moving through darkness, and every narrow alley leading toward the harbor looked endless beneath the storm. You whispered that rainy evenings feel fragile because they disappear while unfolding. I looked toward the glowing coastline below and suddenly forgot how late it was. The thunder faded beyond the distant bay, leaving only scattered droplets behind as the evening deepened slowly into shades of indigo and amber. Maybe storms preserve certain cities inside memory forever by covering them briefly in rain and light. The hillside houses continued glowing softly above the flooded harbor roads, and warm summer wind carried reflections across the sleeping coastal town. No footsteps, no voices, only rain light drifting endlessly through the evening mist. By the time the clouds swallowed the skyline, the ocean had become invisible, except for scattered harbor lights still shining through the rain. Orange streetlights shimmered beneath the summer storm, stretching across the flooded hillside road. You stood beside the rain-dark stone fence, watching clouds gather over the harbor. The sky still held the final traces of sunset, hidden behind layers of heavy rain. And every rooftop along the coastline glowed softly beneath the mist. A warm ocean breeze drifted through the alleyways, carrying the scent of wet flowers, while somewhere beyond the distant seawall, thunder echoed above the bay. You brushed damp strands of hair behind your ear, listening to water slide from the rooftops, and laughed because the puddles looked brighter than the city itself. The steep stairways crossing through the hillside filled slowly with silver rainwater, and every utility pole stretching above the town vanished into drifting fog. You asked why rainy cities feel cinematic even without anyone around. I watched reflections break beneath the falling rain and thought maybe storms erase distractions. Hydrangeas leaned over soaked concrete walls, petals trembling beneath the storm, while tiny harbor windows far below burned gold against the dark clouds. The sea disappeared beneath layers of mist, leaving only scattered lights behind, as stood beside the dripping guardrail quietly, watching reflections move downhill. The transparent umbrella beside your shoulder, filled with fractured neon colors. Far below us, the harbor shimmered faintly, covered in silver rain haze. And every alley leading toward the coastline looked endless beneath the clouds. You whispered that storms feel peaceful when viewed from high above the city. I looked toward the glowing rooftops below and suddenly understood exactly what you meant. The thunder drifted farther into the distance, leaving only soft rainfall behind. As the city lights deepened gradually into violet and midnight blue. Maybe beautiful nights happen unexpectedly, between thunder, between reflections, between the final colors of sunset. The street lights continue glowing through the rainfall across the flooded hillside roads, and the warm summer wind carried silence through the sleeping harbor town. No music, no movement, only orange reflections trembling softly inside the rainwater below. By the time the storm moved beyond the coastline, the city had become entirely blue-gray, except for the street lights still glowing after the rain. Rainwater flowed through the hillside town like silver rivers beneath the street lights. You stood beside the narrow stone pathway, watching the harbor blur beneath the storm. The clouds above the coastline drifted slowly, heavy with the remains of sunset, and every puddle gathered near the stairways held fragments of orange and blue. A warm sea breeze moved through the wet flower vines, scattering droplets across the pavement, while somewhere beyond the darkened bay, thunder rolled softly above the waves. You leaned against the rain, so trailing quietly, listening to water rush downhill, then smiled because the reflections made the city feel endless tonight. The steep roads winding beside the rooftops shine silver beneath the evening mist, and every utility wire crossing the skyline faded into the drifting rain haze. You asked whether storms make memories stronger or simply harder to forget. I watched neon colors tremble through puddles and thought maybe rain slows time itself. Hydrangeas bent beneath the heavy rainfall, petals dark against the glowing streets, while distant harbor windows below the hill burned softly through the fog. The ocean disappeared behind layers of rain, leaving only scattered lights visible as warm summer wind continued moving across the sleeping coastal town. Their evenings hidden inside rainstorms, flooded roads beneath glowing streetlights, cloud shadows drifting over the harbor, and umbrellas shining beside narrow stairways. Evenings where silence feels alive, like the storm is breathing through the city, holding before the night deepens completely. You stood beneath the dripping trees silently, watching reflections slide toward the sea. The transparent umbrella beside your shoulder, filled with fractured colors from the roads below. Far beneath us, headlights crossed wet intersections like streams of gold through darkness. And every alley leading down the hillside looked endless beneath the rain. You whispered that storms feel temporary, even while standing inside them. I looked toward the glowing coastline beyond the mist, and suddenly wished the thunder would stay longer. The rainfall softened into scattered droplets, sliding from tangled electric wires as the clouds darkened slowly into shades of violet and midnight blue. Maybe rain transforms ordinary evenings into places memory never completely leaves. The flooded roads continued carrying reflections across the glowing hillside town, and warm summer wind drifted quietly through the harbor mist below. No footsteps, no conversations, only rainwater flowing endlessly toward the sea beyond the city. By the time the storm faded into the horizon, the rooftops had turned entirely silver blue, except for scattered lights still shimmering through the rain. Misty thunder drifted above the evening coast, low against the fading summer sky. You stood beside the rain-covered stairway, watching clouds gather over the harbor. The roads below us glowed beneath the rainfall, streetlights stretching through puddles, and every rooftop climbing the hillside held traces of the disappearing sunset. A warm wind carried the scent of seawater through the damp evening air, while somewhere beyond the hidden breakwater, lightning flickered behind the clouds. You brushed rainwater from your sleeve slowly, listening to thunder move across the bay, then laughed because the mist made the whole city look unreal. The narrow alleyways twisting through the hillside, filled with silver reflections and shadow, and every telephone wire above the rooftops vanished into drifting fog. You asked why storms feel beautiful only during summer evenings. I watched rainwater slide along the stone pavement and thought maybe warmth changes sadness gently. Hydrangeas leaned over soaked concrete walls, droplets trembling beneath neon light, while distant harbor windows below the hill burned amber through the mist. The sea disappeared beneath layers of rain haze, leaving only blurred lights behind as more rain deeper into darkness. You rested beneath the dripping vines quietly, watching reflections ripple downhill. The umbrella beside your shoulder filled with scattered silver light. Far below as the harbor shimmered faintly, covered in layers of evening mist. And every alley leading toward the coastline looked endless beneath the clouds. You whispered that lightning feels distant, even when the storm is close. I looked toward the glowing horizon above the ocean, and suddenly forgot the sound of the rain. The thunder faded farther beyond the bay, leaving only scattered droplets behind. As the city lights deepened gradually into shades of indigo and gold. Maybe storms blur the line between memory and dream for a few quiet hours before morning washes everything away. The mist continued drifting through the harbor lights, across the flooded hillside roads, and warm summer winds carried silence through the sleeping seaside town. No movement, no music, only distant thunder trembling softly beyond the rain-dark coast. By the time the storm disappeared into the sea, the city had become entirely blue-gray, except for faint reflections still glowing through the mist. Neon reflections drifted across the hillside, rain stretching through puddles beside the stone paths. You stood beneath the tangled hydrangeas quietly, watching evening gather above the harbor. The clouds still carry traces of faded orange, hidden behind layers of blue-gray mist. And every rooftop facing the coastline shimmered beneath the warm summer storm. A soft ocean breeze climbed through the alleyways, moving droplets across the railings, while somewhere beyond the distant seawall, thunder echoed low above the bay. You touched the wet concrete beside the stairway, listening to rainwater flow downhill, then smiled because the reflections made the whole city seem underwater. The narrow roads winding through the hillside filled slowly with silver rain light, and every utility wire crossing the skyline blurred softly inside the fog. You asked why rainy evenings feel endless near towns beside the ocean. I watched puddles tremble beneath neon signs, and thought maybe storms stretch silence farther. Flower petals clung to the soaked stone walls, dark against the glowing streets, while distant harbor windows below the hill burned faintly through the mist. The sea disappeared beneath drifting clouds, leaving only scattered lights visible as warm summer rain continued dripping trees silently, watching reflections slide toward the sea. The transparent umbrella beside your shoulder filled with fractured shades of blue and gold. Far below us, headlights crossed wet intersections like rivers moving through darkness, and every alley leading downhill looked endless beneath the rain. You whispered that storms feel softer when viewed from far above the city. I looked toward the glowing coastline below and forgot how long the night had become. The rainfall weakened into scattered droplets sliding from tangled electric wires as the clouds deepened gradually into shades of indigo and silver. Maybe rain changes cities into paintings for a few quiet hours before morning washes the colors away. The neon reflections continue drifting softly across the flooded hillside roads, and warm summer wind carried silence through the glowing harbor town. No voices, no footsteps, only rainlight moving endlessly toward the darkened sea. By the time the storm faded beyond the coastline, the city had become entirely blue-gray, except for scattered reflections still shimmering through the rain. Rainy twilight settled above the harbor city, soft violet clouds covering the bay. You stood beside the damp hillside railing, watching the coastline disappear into mist. The streets below us glowed beneath street lights, gold reflections stretching through puddles, and every rooftop climbing toward the harbor held traces of fading sunset light. A warm wind drifted through the soaked flower vines, carrying the scent of rain and seawater, while somewhere beyond the dark horizon, lightning flickered behind the clouds. You brushed raindrops from your sleeves slowly, listening to thunder beyond the ocean, then laughed because the mist made the harbor lights look distant. The steep stairways crossing through the hillside shine silver beneath the rainfall, and every telephone wire above the city vanished softly into the fog. You asked why rainy nights feel nostalgic even before they fully end. I watched reflections ripple through the flooded roads and thought maybe storms preserve certain moments. Hydrangeas leaned against old concrete walls, petals dark beneath the neon glow, while distant windows scattered across the town burned amber against the storm. The sea disappeared beneath drifting rain haze, leaving only faint waves behind, as warm summer rain continued falling across the sleeping coastal streets. There are evenings hidden inside rainy twilight streetlights, trembling across flooded alleys, cloud shadows drifting above the waiting for the storm to pass. You lean beneath the dripping vines quietly, watching reflections move downhill. The umbrella beside your shoulder, filled with fractured neon colors. Far below its headlights crossed wet intersections, stretching toward the harbor roads, and every narrow alley beside the hillside looked endless beneath the rain. You whispered that beautiful nights feel temporary, even while standing inside them. I looked toward the glowing coastline beyond the mist, and suddenly wished the storm would stay longer. The thunder drifted farther beyond the sea, leaving only soft rainfall behind. As the city lights deepened gradually into midnight blue and amber. Maybe storms make ordinary evenings unforgettable by wrapping them briefly in light, mist, and silence. The harbor city continued glowing softly beneath the drifting summer rain, and warm ocean wind carried reflections across the flooded hillside roads. No movement, no music, only rainy twilight breathing slowly above the sleeping coast. By the time the clouds swallowed the horizon, the streets had become rivers of light, and the night air smelled entirely of rain and sea water. Rain-colored clouds gathered above the seaside hill, covering the evening sky in silver blue. You stood beside the narrow stone stairway, watching the harbor dim beneath the storm. The rose below us shimmered with reflections, orange and violet through the puddles, and every rooftop facing the coastline glowed softly beneath the rainfall. A warm wind drifted through the soaked flower vines, shaking droplets onto the pavement, while somewhere beyond the darkened seawall, thunder rolled quietly above the waves. You rested your hand against the wet railing silently, listening to rainwater rush downhill, then smiled because the mist made the city lights blur together beautifully. The steep hillside paths curved through the darkness, silver beneath the glowing street lamps, and every utility wire crossing the skyline disappeared into drifting fog. You ask why storms make nights feel cinematic, even when nothing really changes. I watched reflections ripple beside the stairways, and thought maybe rain slows everything gently. Hydrangeas leaned against old stone walls, petals dark beneath the neon glow, while distant harbor windows far below burned softly through the mist. The ocean disappeared behind layers of rain haze, leaving only faint lights visible as warm summer rain continued falling across the sleeping coastal town. There are evenings hidden inside rain clouds, streetlights trembling across flooded roads, umbrellas glowing beside narrow stairways, and You stood beneath the dripping trees quietly, watching reflections slide toward the sea. The transparent umbrella beside your shoulder, filled with broken shades of gold and blue. Far below us, headlights crossed wet intersections like rivers flowing through darkness. And every alley winding down the hillside looked endless beneath the rain. You whispered that beautiful nights disappear quickly, even while they're still unfolding. I looked toward the glowing coastline beyond the fog and suddenly forgot the sound of the thunder. The rainfall softened into scattered droplets, sliding slowly from tangled electric wires as the clouds deepened gradually into shades of indigo and silver. Maybe storms turn ordinary cities into places people remember forever, without understanding why. The rain-colored clouds continued drifting slowly above the glowing harbor roads, and warm summer wind carried silence through the flooded hillside town. No footsteps, no conversations, only reflections trembling softly inside the evening rain. By the time the storm faded beyond the coastline, the sea had become almost invisible, except for scattered harbor lights still shining